Good morning. Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Church of Spokane, where our mission is to join together to create a nourishing, liberal religious home and to champion justice, diversity, and environmental stewardship in our wider world, or as we say in short, to create community, find meaning, and work for justice. Welcome to one and all. I want to begin, as always, by welcoming all that you bring with you to this space today, all of your unique beliefs, your background, your lifestyle, your experiences, your differences. Everything that helps make you who you are is welcome here this morning. And this, of course, includes those who hear me say this each Sunday, as well as those who might be hearing it for the first time this morning. You're equally as welcome. And, of course, it includes those who are streaming with us. So welcome to one and all this morning. Wanted to start by letting you know that Aria Curtis, who's going to be leaving us in a few weeks, we have put a book in the back for you to sign and maybe write a thought or note or best wishes to during social hours, so you'll find that on the table behind you, and I'm sure Aria would appreciate that. And then I want to take a few moments at the start of this morning's service to talk a little bit about the continuing fallout from my self-published book, The Gadfly Papers. As many of you know, I wrote this book about my concerns regarding the direction that Unitarian Universalism is heading, and gave it away during the General Assembly when it was here last month in June. It sparked immediate outrage and is now being discussed by Unitarian Universalists throughout the country. These past weeks have been the most emotionally difficult in my life, and I'm not exaggerating there, because I'm not used to so much rage and hate being directed my way, in addition to much gratitude and support from UUs around the country as well. But I'm not really concerned about the national response to my book, at least not emotionally concerned about that. The matter that really continues to sicken my stomach every day is knowing that there are members of this congregation who are troubled by my book, either by its content or because of its aftermath. And I have tried to apologize to those that I know are or were directly impacted by some of that fallout, and to those who have expressed their concerns directly to me. Yet I know that there are others who have not yet felt comfortable doing so. And some of you are understandably upset that you were blindsided and that the eruption that occurred at the General Assembly made you feel robbed of what should have been a positive experience for you, positive and exciting experience. And I completely understand and agree that you deserved this. Please know that this was never my intention, nor something I expected would have happened so quickly in regard to my book. And I do want to publicly apologize again to you now and tell you how much my heart aches knowing that my actions have led to your emotional pain. I'm very sorry, and if I had known, I surely would have done things differently. And if and when you're ready, please know that I want to hear your concerns in the hope that we can restore our relationship. I care about you, and I'm sorry. And after I made this statement during the first service, somebody very kindly came up and said, "You don't have to apologize to all of us, Todd." And I know, and I appreciate the support that so many of you have shown me. But it doesn't mean that as a community that we're all always on the same page. And it doesn't mean that even if a lot of us are on the same page, that there aren't some of us who aren't. And part of being a community is wanting to love one another enough to where, regardless of those differences, we can come together and stay together and be as whole as we can. or at least give people that opportunity and that choice to be there, to be in that space. So I want to apologize where I can apologize to those of you who may be hurt, and I encourage you as a congregation to, as much as a lot of us would just rather say, well, let's just move on, we have other fights to fight and other things to do, let's fight those and do those, but let's also hear from those who have reason to be upset or reasons that they feel they need to be upset, and to be able to embrace those and welcome those into our community as well. So again, I want to be able to be in that relationship with everyone in this congregation, and I will definitely apologize where I feel that it is appropriate to do so. And I'm doing that now. Thank you. Thank you. And on that wonderful note, why don't we take some time to show our appreciation for one another by taking some moments to greet each other this morning. Thank you, and as always, there'll be more opportunity to visit with one another after our service during social hour. For now, let's move forward by lighting our chalice, the symbol of our faith, the symbol of our unity and our solidarity, of our openness and our inclusion, of our community and our individual uniqueness. May this small flame be our offering of warmth to those who are cold and alone, and a light to those in darkness. May it be a flame that ignites justice in our world and a beacon of hope to those in need, and may it reflect at least a spark of truth wherever truth has been lost, and cast a healthy shadow of doubt wherever it's been found.
Our opening words this morning are taken from an essay by Caitlin Curtis from the June 12th issue of Sojourners magazine just this summer. The world feels really heavy lately. And when things feel particularly heavy, it's easy to lose sight of what's ahead, to lose sight of hope. But we must remember that the work of justice has no sides and isn't categorized neatly into political statements. Justice simply happens in the margins, where wrongs are made right for the oppressed. Justice happens when the heart of God, the way of love, makes itself known and seen among us. Justice work must stretch far past our current president, and it must stretch into all political parties. It stretches into every religion, into cultures all over the world. Justice work must be envisioned across the world, where atrocities happen every day that we are unaware of. So we must be citizens of the earth, not just our own nations. Justice work must bear in mind the goodness of the earth, an earth that deserves our attention, our care, and our love, an earth that actually teaches us what justice is. The long haul of justice is universal, and we simply step into a current that is already moving, trusting that it leads us to become the people we need to be.
Okay, if you'll rise in body and spirit to sing hymn number 12. O life that maketh all things new.
Good morning. I would like to invite forward our young and our young at heart for a time for all ages. And while they are coming forward, good morning, I am wondering how many of you know, off the top of your head, our 7 principles? A few. Yeah. I'm pretty amazed because they're difficult to remember. I have been a part of UU churches my whole life, and I still sometimes, when somebody asks me, have to sit and go, okay, so there's the inherent worth and dignity, and there's a web, and something else, and something. And we covenant to affirm and promote them, I think. But why is it important to even try and remember them in the first place? What are the 7 principles to us? A guide? Yeah, they're the principles by which we live. They are our values. They're what we as a church and as a congregation of congregations have decided is important to us. And those words are important. We covenant to affirm and promote. What does that mean? Live by it. Yeah. So a covenant is both a noun and a verb. It means that we make a promise to one another together, that we will uphold these values in our lives and in the life of this congregation and in other congregations. So, our 7 principles are not all that we are, but they're an important part of how we define ourselves. And with that premise, I have a hopefully fun tool that I would like to share with you for remembering what those principles are. At some point, a long time ago, a religious educator had a stroke of genius. That religious educator set our 7 principles to song. So, do any of you know Do, Re, Mi from The Sound of Music? Yeah. Do any of you know? Maybe heard it. All right, so you may see where I'm going with this. But let's sing Do, Re, Mi together to remind ourselves of the tune. Susan is going to help me. So I will start and just join in as you feel called. Do, a deer, a female deer. Re, a drop of golden sun. Mi, a name I call myself. Fa, a long, long way to run. So, a needle pulling thread. La, a note to follow. So, tea, a drink with jam and bread. That will bring us back to Do. Oh. Okay, we've got that down. So now we're going to set our 7 principles to that tune. And we're going to do this, right? I'm going to sing a line, and then you will repeat after me, okay? 1, each person is important.
1, each person is important.
2, be kind in all you do.
2, be kind in all you do.
3, we're free to learn together.
3, we're free to learn together.
4, and search for what is true.
4, and search for what is true.
5, all people have a voice.
5, all people have a voice.
6, build a fair and peaceful world.
6, build a fair and peaceful world.
7, we care for Earth's lifeboat.
7, we care for Earth's lifeboat.
That will bring us back to me and you. Okay. 7 was we care for Earth's lifeboat. Yeah. Okay, so now that we have done it, sort of, let's sing it all together, all the way through. You're welcome to rise in body or spirit as you feel called. You may also remain sitting. All right, I'm just going to start, and then you can join in. 1, each person is important. 2, be kind in all you do. 3, we're free to learn together. 4, and search for what is true. 5, all people have a voice. 6, build a fair and peaceful world. 7, we care for Earth's light hopes that will bring us back to me and you. Wonderful. Thank you for indulging me. So now we are going to go plant some peas and nasturtiums. So let's come over here and we can light our children's chalice together.
We light this second chalice so that as our children and youth go to their chapels, they carry the light of our flame with them. May it illuminate, inspire, and warm you as it does us. We now gratefully give and receive this morning's offering, which sustains this church and its mission in the wider world.
Bethlehem, a manger waits, long ago and so today, where hatred-weary people pray, love will come and lay there. And so do countless stables stand, in hearts as harsh as desert lands, rough shelters in the wind and sand, that love may come and stay there. Love that opens fists of hate, heaps of gold on beggars' plates, love that shows a kindly face to enemies and strangers. And the walls of stables tremble so when the winds of fear and judgment blow, for stables hope in love alone, and knows that love's the answer. Oh, love's the prophet's only word, the only lesson left to learn, the only hand of heaven's work, and the only road that goes there. Love that sees with mercy's eyes, hold its arms up open wide, threads its loops with separate lives, and weaves them all together. So may the lamps of stables glow, brightly in their light may go, for miles in the darkness so love will find its way there.
Thank you, Susan, so much. I always appreciate when you sing and play for us. It just takes me back to growing up in the 60s and 70s and just how powerful a single voice and a guitar could be to say something so beautiful and so meaningful at the same time. Thank you. We're going to kindle our candles of care now for those who are most on our hearts and minds this morning, and want to continue to light a candle for Dominique Wallace and her entire family. Her 19-year-old sister-in-law is still in critical condition. Also, Claire Serling Hansen has asked that we light a candle for her husband, Daryl, who was seriously injured, not life-threatening, but seriously injured in a dirt bike accident yesterday. A candle for Linda Clark and Michael Smith's daughter, Annie, and their entire family. Annie's going to be having major breast cancer surgery on Tuesday, so please keep them in your thoughts and hearts as well. And then my dear friend Happy Watkins called me actually twice yesterday to process and ask us to actually double up and light 2 candles for him today. He's ministering to a family whose 2-month-old infant died accidentally over the weekend under very tragic and disturbing circumstances. And it is just extraordinarily difficult for everyone, and I know as a minister, to try to go into that situation and try to be of some help is really, really hard. So he's asked us to think of him and this family in our candle lighting ceremony today. So let's take a moment of silence on behalf of others, and as always, you're welcome to name them aloud at this time if you'd like. Those named aloud and those embraced in our silence, and all those who are suffering in our world at this hour, we hold in our community with compassion.
This is the time in our service where we take a few moments for silent meditation, so I invite you to make yourself comfortable as you wish. Close your eyes if you'd like. Take a breath. The words to take us into meditation this morning are from the Reverend Dr. Michael A. Schuler. Cherish your doubts, for doubt is the servant of truth. Question your convictions, for beliefs too tightly held strangle the mind and its natural wisdom. Suspect all certitudes, for the world whirls on, nothing abides. Yet in our inner rooms full of doubt, inquiry, and suspicion, let a corner be reserved for trust. For without trust, there is no space for communities to gather or for friendships to be forged. Indeed, this is the small corner where we connect and reconnect with each other.
Today I'm going to read from my first controversial book, The Gospel for Liberals, from a section in here called The Gospel According to Todd. And I was not happy with the four Gospels, so I wrote my own. And I encourage you to do the same. So I'm going to read my origin, version of the origin story, and then just a couple of stories, my treatments of a couple of healing stories. This is the story of Jesus, later called Christ, and later still the Son of God. He began his life without a father, and was known only as the illegitimate son of a young maiden named Mary. After he was grown, he became a disciple of a popular, though peculiar, wilderness prophet named John, who emphasized the forgiveness of sins. That was new, through repentance and baptism. Growing up fatherless in his society made Jesus feel dirty and ashamed because he'd been taught that he was born in sin and was forever unclean in the eyes of God. He was often ridiculed, ostracized, and discriminated against because of it. But at the moment of his own baptism in the sacred Jordan River, Jesus felt he'd been washed completely clean. Even while still emerging from the cold water, he suddenly understood that he too was worthy of God's love. And for the first time in his life, he knew what it was like to belong. You are my child, God's all-inclusive Spirit seemed to say. I love you, and I'm pleased with you. One Sabbath, while in Capernaum, Jesus entered the synagogue and began teaching his astounding message about God's universal love. He seemed to teach with confidence from his heart instead of merely quoting the scriptures like the literalists do. Just then, a man the authorities had demonized burst in and started yelling, "What good is your good news to people like me, Nazarene? Aren't you just another holy man who wants us destroyed because you find us repulsive?" But Jesus countered, "Stop talking like that. You're a child of God. There's nothing repulsive about you, so cut it out." The man was so moved that he began shaking and cried out in a loud voice. Those who saw it were amazed and began asking, "What is this? This teaching of universal love is like nothing we've ever heard before, yet he teaches it with such confidence. He even welcomes those the authorities say are mad." Incidents like this caused Jesus' fame to spread throughout the region. Another time, they happened to visit the home of Peter and Andrew at the same time Peter's mother-in-law had come down with a high fever. Even though the sickness made her unclean, and it was considered inappropriate for a man who wasn't her husband to touch her, Jesus tried to comfort her by holding her hand. And soon she began feeling better. Before long, she was on her feet again and started serving her guest. By nightfall, everyone who was sick or demonized ended up at the door. It seemed the entire town had surrounded the house. Jesus comforted as many of the sick as he could and welcomed those who had been demonized.
In the ever-shifting water, the this life. I was swimming, seeking comfort. I was wrestling waves to find boulder I could cling to, stone to hold me fast. Where I let the fretful water of this river around me pass. So I found an anchor, a blessed resting place, a trusty rock I called my Savior, for there I would be saved from the river and its dangers, and I proclaimed my rock divine, and I prayed to it protect me, and the rock replied, God is a river, not just a stone. God is a wild raging rapids and slow meandering flow. God is a deep and narrow passage, peaceful sandy shore. God is a river swimmer, so let go. Still I clung to my rock tightly, with conviction in my arms, never looking at the stream to keep my mind from thoughts of harm. But the river kept on coming, kept on tugging at my legs, till at last my fingers faltered and I was swept away. So I'm going with the flow now, these relentless twists and bends, acclimating to the motion and a sense of being led. And this river's like my body now, it carries me along through the ever-changing scenes and by the rocks that sing this song. God is a river, not just a stone. God is a wild raging rapids and slow meandering flow. God is a deep and narrow passage, peaceful sandy shore. God is a river swimmer, so let go.
Thanks again. Nicolina, thank you. Was Jesus a humanist? To answer this, it's prudent to first discuss what I mean by humanist or humanism. And to do so, it's additionally important to recognize the difference between humanism with a small h and humanism with a capital H. Because these days we tend to associate the word with a particular philosophy originating in the early part of the 20th century, solidifying with the adoption of the Humanist Manifesto in 1933. Formal humanism, the kind with capital H, began here in our church with Reverend John H. Dietrich, our minister between 1911 and 1916, when he was reading an article on Auguste Comte's philosophy of positivism, which Dietrich loosely defined as the religion of humanity. But the article's author had shortened to just humanism with a small h. It was then, according to his biographer, Dietrich realized this age-honored word, this humanism, would be a good name for his interpretation of religion in contrast to theism. This didn't mean that Dietrich was an atheist, only that he believed religion ought to focus on human welfare, not supernatural beliefs. He went on to become known as the father of religious humanism, was an original signer of the Humanist Manifesto, and established the Humanist pulpit at the First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis after leaving Spokane. And secular humanism also emerged out of this same movement. But humanism with a small h, the kind that influenced Comte's thinking to begin with, emerged during the Renaissance period between the 14th and the 17th centuries in reference to the renewed appreciation of the much earlier thinking, still, of classic Greek and Roman philosophers like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, Democritus, Epicurus, but summarized in the words of Protagoras, man is the measure of all things. This may not sound so extraordinary or heretical now, but in the 5th century BCE, when Protagoras made this controversial statement, people generally believed what happened in the world, including the societies they lived in and the events of their own lives, were up to the fates and to the gods, and was thus beyond all human influence. The notion that human beings were a deciding factor in the direction of their own lives and could influence the world around them was radical and sparked a debate we have in many ways continued to have to this day. However, it wasn't just their novel way of thinking about humanity that attracted the Renaissance thinkers to these classical philosophers, but also their method of thinking itself. The notion of basing our ideas on reason and empirical facts was also considered an important part of humanism with a small h. Our small h humanistic church expressed this mindset in its founding bylaws established in 1888, 55 years before the signing of the Manifesto, with the statement that I often enjoy reciting: the authority of its belief is reason, the method of its finding its beliefs is scientific, its aim is to crush superstition and establish facts of religion. This same sentiment was later expressed similarly in formal capital H humanism in the Manifesto, which states, "Humanism asserts that the nature of the universe, depicted by modern science, makes unacceptable any supernatural or cosmic guarantees of human values. Obviously, humanism does not deny the possibility of realities as yet undiscovered, but it does insist that the way to determine the existence and value of any and all realities is by means of intelligent inquiry and by the assessment of their relations to human needs. Religion must formulate its hopes and plans in light of the scientific spirit and method." So these are the qualities both formal and informal humanism share in common: a belief in the humanistic ethic, meaning that which we ought to focus our moral efforts on is human growth and well-being. Human agency, meaning it's up to us to shape our world and our communities toward this end, and a devotion to seeking truth and knowledge through objective reason and empirical evidence. As one online dictionary more succinctly says, humanism is a philosophical and ethical stance that emphasizes the value and agency of human beings, individually and collectively, and generally prefers critical thinking and evidence over acceptance of dogma and superstition. So to answer the question at hand, was Jesus a humanist? We must conclude if he was, he would have to be a humanist with a small h, since he lived and died long before the emergence of formal humanism. So the real question is whether his life and teachings demonstrate his belief in and commitment to human welfare, human agency, and some sort of reason, or at least empirical reality. And how do we go about answering this when there are 4 different gospel accounts that often contradict each other and portray him in very different ways? In general, the earlier a particular gospel was written, the more human Jesus is portrayed. Conversely, the later they were written, the more divine he is depicted. The earliest account, the Gospel of Mark, for example, written around 65 CE, begins with Jesus being baptized by John the Baptist. Upon emerging from the waters, he realizes he's a child of God. This is what scholars call an adoptionistic Christology. It's a very low Christology because Jesus is just an ordinary person who has had a profound religious experience. Likewise, at the end of Mark, after Jesus' death, the story ends with some of his followers discovering an empty tomb. There isn't a resurrection account in it, and it doesn't mention any Jesus sightings. It's just a creative way to conclude an otherwise tragic ending with a little mystery and a little hope. In the next account, the Gospel of Matthew, written around 70 CE, Jesus' story begins with his human birth, not his adult baptism, but his human birth from Mary, a descendant of King David, and ends with some of his followers encountering the risen Jesus, who promises to remain with them to the very end of the age. In this story, nobody actually makes physical contact with Jesus, and his continued presence implies only that he will remain with them in spirit. Wherever 2 or more are gathered in his name, he will be in their midst. By the time the Gospel of Luke is written, around 90 CE, Jesus' story begins even earlier, with his conception, and ends with a physical resurrection as proven by risen Jesus eating and interacting with his followers, and an ascension story explaining why, if his resurrection wasn't merely spiritual, he's not still present with us on earth. Finally, when we get to the Gospel of John, written in the early part of the 2nd century, a new century altogether, Jesus becomes Christ. Not as an adult, not at his birth, not at his conception, but before the creation of everything. Right? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. In John, there's no doubt that Jesus' resurrection is physical, given that he eats and drinks with his followers and allows them to actually feel the scars and the wounds from his crucifixion and torture. We can see from these, as the story of Jesus evolved over time, the more literal it was taken, going from the hint of a resurrection as a literary device to the eventual belief in a physical, historical resurrection, and from being the story of a human being who began a religious movement to the story of one who was with God and was God. That's called a high Christology because Jesus is now viewed as a divinity. I bring all of this up to point out that if we're going to answer any questions about Jesus, whether he was a humanist or anything else, we have to first decide which Jesus we're talking about. Human Jesus or divine Christ? Historical Jesus or the Christ of faith? The subversive religious teacher who was executed by the Roman government and religious authorities? Or the God who existed before time, became incarnate, died, and was miraculously resurrected to redeem all of humanity? Do we accept the human stories of Jesus or the supernatural stories told about him? I suspect that there are far more people in the world to this day who believe in the supernatural stories than not. But I think it's more reasonable to believe Jesus was an ordinary human being whose story through time became obscured by mythology and fiction. Our Unitarian tradition is epitomized by this humanistic idea of Jesus. The very word Unitarian refers to an original monotheistic belief in only one God. And since Jesus was not God, he, like everyone else, had to be a human being, extraordinary as he may have been. After Rome was Christianized, and Christianity therefore was Hellenized, however, it became perfectly acceptable to believe in many gods and to worship humans as gods. This led to the doctrine of the Trinity in the 4th century CE, and to the outlawing of Unitarianism, the belief in Jesus' humanity. But when the Unitarian idea was reawakened after the invention of the printing press in the 15th century, its proponents immediately began questioning the divinity of Jesus all over again. Its official founder, Michael Servetus, was burned alive in 1553 for writing a book. My goodness. The book was called On the Errors of the Trinity. And the Unitarian Bishop of Transylvania, Ferenc David, was condemned for saying it made about as much sense for Protestants to pray to Jesus as for Catholics to pray to Mary. Pretty radical stuff for the 15th century. Many others came to share this humanistic Christology, believing that Jesus was an admirable man, but a man nonetheless. Faustus Socinus, for example, a contemporary and friend of David, taught that salvation doesn't come from Jesus' death, but by putting his humanitarian teachings into practice. He also rejected the idea of original sin and human depravity. Although American Unitarianism emerged independently from Eastern European Unitarianism, it did so for many of the same reasons. Rejecting the divinity of Jesus and the doctrine of original sin, while conversely embracing his humanity and human agency and goodness. American Unitarians, like Reverend Charles Chauncey, minister of Boston's First Church in the larger part of the 18th century, argued that instead of needing to be born again, human beings are born with the capacity for both sin and righteousness, which was radical. There's something good about us to begin with. Can you imagine? In the early 20th century, the Universalist General Convention adopted a declaration rejecting the idea of inherent depravity that also claimed that mankind is led into sin by evil surroundings, by the evils of unjust social and economic systems. And of course, you've already heard me talk about the importance of Reverend John Dietrich to the birth of formal humanism just a few years later. So being Unitarians, it seems likely that we would side with the humanistic interpretation of Jesus. Still, being human doesn't necessarily make one a humanist. Sadly, there are many of us who are not, including many Unitarians these days. So how do we begin to answer the question, was he a humanist? We could turn to his teachings, but we end up with the very same problem we have with Jesus himself. Which teachings do we accept are authentic? According to the Jesus Seminar, comprised of hundreds of scholars whom, after years of research, voted to determine the historical reliability of the many claims about him, less than 20% of everything Jesus is claimed to have said or done may have happened. But even this much is uncertain. They are far surer of the more than 80% they say never happened than they are of the less than 20% they believe may have happened, or at least have a kernel of truth, historical truth to it. Many believe that the few statements about him that may have happened were originally sayings or stories passed down through oral tradition. the gospel writers recorded some of these traditions in their embellished narratives. So at best, the Gospels probably contain a few original, authentic Jesus sayings, perhaps some stories embedded in lots of made-up stories about him. So with all this in mind, we must look toward common themes and short sayings in the Gospels that may get at the heart of the historical Jesus. We're looking for consistency. Yet it doesn't take much to recognize Jesus' teachings are largely concerned with human welfare. I personally believe, as a Jewish person living under Roman tyranny, Jesus must have known what it meant to be oppressed, regardless of his historical background. If, as some stories suggest, he was fatherless, a mamzer, as his Jewish society called him, he was also an oppressed outcast of his own culture and society, his Jewish community. So the transformative religious experience he had upon his baptism, realizing that he is a child of God and that God is pleased with him, led him to publicly claim, despite his low social status, he is both a son of God, meaning that he is worthy of compassion, and a son of man, meaning that he is a human being. He belongs to the human race and thus is worthy of the same respect as everyone else. This was the good news that he preached and taught everywhere he went, especially to those who were most oppressed, ostracized, and demonized by his society. And we see this repeated in the many stories of Jesus being criticized for eating and publicly associating with those the authorities and culture considered unclean and unworthy. Because that's what religious authorities do. They create Puritanism, whether it's around how you eat or how you speak or what you think or what you say. The outcasts, the sinners, the foreigners, the heretics, women, the traitors, and anyone else who had been dehumanized. You see, Jesus didn't literally cast out demons. There's no such thing. He only cast off the demonization of others by treating them with compassion and respect. In Mark, the earliest of the Gospels, to give just one example, a man with leprosy came to him and begged him on his knees, "If you are willing, you can make me clean." Jesus was indignant. He reached out his hand and touched the man. "I am willing," he said. "Be clean." Immediately the leprosy left him and he was cleansed. It's an extraordinary account because being a leper epitomizes what it meant to be considered socially and spiritually unclean and untouchable in Jesus' society. Yet he heals the man by touching him. That's what healed him. Not supernatural magic, just being touched, included, welcomed back into society. The very next story in Mark tells similarly of a man who had been paralyzed, symbolic perhaps of one who had been so beaten down by his oppressive society that he had no more moves. He had no standing. He couldn't find work. He couldn't associate with others. He had nothing. Jesus heals him by saying, "Your sins are forgiven. Get up, pick up your mat, and walk." This, to me, is not the story of a literal healing, but a metaphor of restoring a person's dignity of treating a human being as a human being, as an upstanding member of the community. That's how we heal our society, and that is a humanistic approach. In the very same chapter, Jesus is criticized for encouraging his hungry followers to pick up grain and eat it on the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, he responded. The Son of Man, the human being, is Lord even over the Sabbath. If my interpretation of Son of Man is correct, this is like saying rules were made to benefit human welfare. Humans don't exist to benefit the rules. Human welfare is more important than the rules. That's a humanistic ethic. In this earliest of the gospel accounts, while Jesus is healing another demonized person and is himself accused of being out of his mind and the prince of demons by the angry religious authorities, he's told that his family is waiting outside, presumably to talk some sense into him before he gets himself into real trouble. He didn't listen. But at this point he says, "Who are my mother and my brothers?" he asked. Notice he doesn't say father, because in the Markan account, Jesus doesn't have a father. Then he looks at those seated in the circle around him and he says, "Here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does God's will is my brother," and he adds, "and sister and mother." Whoever does God's will is my mother and my sister and my brother. And the will of God is to heal one another by loving one another. This story also indicates that Jesus recognized our common humanity. That regardless of our individual identities, we are all human beings, part of one family. That's another humanistic value. As the Gospel of Mark continues, it includes a story of Jesus healing a woman who had been considered perpetually unclean her entire life by once again making public contact with her and praising her for her strong faith. You're not unclean, you're not untouchable. What an incredible example of religious faith you are. Imagine how that would feel. It includes stories of him healing the sick and feeding the hungry and educating children, and of healing those whose hearts had been hardened and were unable to see or hear others as human beings, as well as restoring the voices of those who could not speak because they had been silenced, the mute. And stories of throngs of hurting people wanting to touch him and to be touched by him. He may not have known Aristotelian logic, but Jesus was an empiricist in as much as he concentrated on the real-world suffering that was going on around him, of those around him, not on supernatural ideas that could have made him feel righteously distant from the concerns of this world. Rather than waiting to go to heaven, he sought to establish heaven on earth. When asked how he summed up his religious beliefs, he said, "Love the Lord your God with all of your heart and with all of your soul and with all of your mind and with all of your strength." But how exactly are we supposed to put that into practice? By loving your neighbor as yourself. Make it real. Islam says, wherever you turn, there is the face of Allah. Turn, look at each other. There, you just saw Allah. That's the face of Allah. That's loving your neighbor as yourself. Stories like these abound in all the Gospels. Whether they are historically accurate or not, they seem abundant enough to get at the heart of who Jesus was, a man with a human heart that prioritized human welfare and human agency in order to deal with the difficult realities too many humans face. Though I no longer consider myself a Christian in the traditional sense, as a humanist, I hope I can follow his example by treating everyone, even my enemies, as dignified members of my human family, by welcoming those who have been demonized, uplifting those who have been beaten down, working toward a society that feeds its poor, that heals its sick, that educates its children, and that is touched by the suffering of others and reaches out to touch them back to make us all whole. Amen.
Arise in body and spirit for the last hymn of the day, 276, O Young and Fearless Prophet.
Our closing words this morning are from Bell Hooks, from her essay, Love as the Practice of Freedom. The moment we choose to love, we begin to move against domination, against oppression. The moment we choose to love, we begin to move towards freedom, to act in ways that liberate ourselves and others. That action is the testimony of love as the practice of freedom. Amen. Blessed be. Assalamu alaikum. Shalom. you.